Hi, and welcome to Digital Defense, our weekly cybersecurity show here from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. News Bureau. My name is Jordan Robertson, a cybersecurity reporter for Bloomberg. And as always on this weekly show, this is an interactive show, so we encourage anybody watching on Facebook or YouTube or any other channels to write in with your questions, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. This week's subject, we're going to return to election hacking, but we're not going to look at the U.S. We're going to look at Germany, and we're starting to see the early signs of essentially kind of a repeat of what we saw in the U.S. elections in regard to Russian hacking and Russian tampering. I should say suspected Russian hacking and tampering. And so I want to walk you all through kind of what some of those early signs are, that we're seeing out of Germany, what it might mean for their elections in 2017, and really what it means overall for the big picture, regarding Russian influence in cyberspace, and how certain cyber weapons and information operations are being used to shape foreign policy, in the U.S. and Europe. So we'll dive right in. I mean, as everybody knows by now, there was suspected aggressive and widespread attempts to influence the U.S. presidential election through Russian information operations, from WikiLeaks email leaks to cyber attacks and other measures. And what we've seen in Germany are kind of the early signs of something very similar happening. Next year, Germany is going to be holding their elections, and what we're starting to see is basically the same type of tensions that exist between the U.S. and Russia, are also there for U.S. and Germany as well. And a lot of this goes back to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the seizing, of Crimea, in 2014. After that, the U.S. As well as the EU, imposed really strict sanctions on Russia, and Russian President Putin, has not been happy about that, and a lot of this animosity can be traced, to that incident. And we've seen some really interesting stuff happen in Germany, since that's happened. I want to take you back to one of them that we reported on, not too long ago here at Bloomberg, and this was a story we did in 2015. Cyberspace becomes the second front in Russia's clash with NATO. And one of the interesting things we discovered in reporting this story was that there was a blast furnace explosion, in Germany that was triggered by a cyber attack. And that was, that explosion occurred at, a large German firm, ThyssenKrupp, and large steel maker. They make elevators and escalators and operate these large steel facilities. What happened was, a suspected and well-known Russian hacking group, is believed to have been behind this really kind of rare and extraordinary event, which is the use of a cyber attack to blow up and disrupt, a blast furnace. And basically, they caused it to overheat and shut down and kind of malfunction in the most severe way one of these things can. And the significance of that is, again, early signs of this kind of growing tension between Russia and Germany being expressed in cyberspace. And what's happened since then has been pretty compelling. There's this really interesting report that came out of the Atlantic Council, the Kremlin's Trojan horses. Russia has been, expert at information operations for a very long time before, kind of hacking even existed in its present form. And what we're starting to see in a lot of places like the U.S., but also, Western Europe and Eastern Europe certainly as well, are these information operations that take, heavy advantage of the fact that online it's very hard to tell, who's promulgating certain information. So the use of fake identities, the use of hacked information, all to promote certain ideas. And there are few places that we've seen this employed with more strength and kind of vigor than Germany right now. And this report goes into a lot of details of that. One of those operations that I wanted to highlight for you guys is, warnings coming out like this. These are pretty typical of the types of stories coming out of Europe right now, which is, Germany's spy chief is warning that Russian hackers could tamper with their election. They saw what happened in the U.S. election, and they're picking up signs that this could happen here as well. So these types of stories go into a lot of depth about the types of attacks that Germany's intelligence services are seeing, and specifically what their targets are, which I'll get to in a minute, which are kind of exclusively political in nature. We've got a couple of questions coming in, so I want to make sure I get to those. First question is, what kind of things are they hacking? Computers, phones, apps. What's been happening in these Russian information operations is, you hear a lot from security experts that, even if you're a government intelligence service, you don't necessarily want to hack directly into your opponent's, intelligence service and kind of expose all of your most sophisticated capabilities, because then you can't use them anymore. So what they do is they start at a very kind of low level, and they're hacking email. Phones are a little bit harder to hack, so laptops, servers, but mostly email. Like, the DNC hacking here in the U.S., that was primarily a phishing operation, which is sending, really well-crafted emails to high-level individuals saying, hey, your Google account has been compromised, click this link and reset your password. Really basic stuff, but once the attackers are inside the network, they employ some kind of more sophisticated tools to extract the information. So in regard to this question, what are they hacking? Email is where they start. Email is where they always start. And the lesson from this is always, if you get an email that's unsolicited, go check it out for yourself. Any unsolicited email, whether it's spam or requests like this from Google, just go research it yourself. And if you think your Gmail account has been compromised, go find the official Google link and then reset it yourself. Don't click on anything in your email. Next question is, what's the latest on the DNC hack? Was it proven that it was Russia? All signs from the U.S. intelligence community point to it being a Russian operation. Now, anything like that involving Russia comes with an asterisk. It comes with a caveat, which is, from the best that we can tell, a lot of the operations out of Russia, hacking operations, come from essentially third parties. So these are contract entities, much like a defense contractor firm would be in the U.S. So a third party, kind of nominally separate from the government, but that does a lot of these, that do a lot of these advanced hacks. So the best intelligence coming out of the U.S., cybersecurity community is that this was very clearly a Russian, operation. The same malware that was used throughout Eastern Europe to attack Russian, targets of interest were used to attack the DNC. The techniques, the command and control, servers, all of the kind of fingerprints of, of Russian operations, were there for, in the U.S. operation as well. All 17 of the U.S. intelligence agencies have come out in unison and said, we believe this was a Russian operation. Where there is some disagreement publicly at this point is, was the operation designed to just undercut U.S. legitimacy and democratic legitimacy, or was it to elect Donald Trump? There's a lot of disagreement about that, and it's unclear if we'll ever get to a clear answer on that. But what is clear is that at its very base, these operations were designed to undercut the legitimacy of U.S. elections, and promote the idea that the democratic institutions in place in the U.S., are not free of corruption either. Another question is, we have a comment about the vulnerability of elections in Australia and Canada. Are those countries taking precautions to protect their political systems, from cyber attacks? Every country, I think, every major country is taking a lesson from what we saw in the U.S. election. And, whereas a lot of cybersecurity experts, intelligence officials had worried about the security of election systems, hacking the actual voting systems, what we saw in the U.S. was not that. And, and regular viewers of this show will know that we've discussed this, that, those are very hard systems to hack. So that's just not where hackers go. Hackers go for the easy kill, which are information operations. If you can promulgate enough false information, or highlight hacked information that's disparaging to your opponent, that's just much more powerful in convincing people to do things, that kind of adhere to your wishes. And in this case, a Trump administration is obviously much more sympathetic, shall we say, to the wishes of the Russian president. So a lot of other countries are taking a look at that and thinking, how do we counter these massive disinformation operations? It's a hard question to answer because the technology companies can do a lot, to block fake news and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, people who are reading, their Facebook news feeds, watching their Twitter feeds, they're going to see a lot of this stuff all the time. And how do you prevent voters from being manipulated in this way is a much harder question than just a technology one. We're getting a lot of questions today, which is great. One of these questions was, why are there so many hacking reports from Russia? What about other countries? Surely they're not the only country with this ability. Well, that's certainly a valid concern. And I've asked this to researchers as well. We've seen reports about NSA hacking, It's not often, outside of Edward Snowden's disclosures, but we see a lot of stuff about Russia. And a lot of stuff from the U.S. about Russia. And there are a few different reasons for that. A couple of the explanations I've gotten is that, the cybersecurity industry is based here in the U.S. We have the most advanced, cybersecurity industry in the world, outside of a few exceptions. Israel certainly has a strong capability, and some other countries as well. Russia has some of the best hackers in the world, and the U.S. does as well. But our industry is so strong here that, and so kind of entrenched inside a lot of companies and government, that we just see a lot, and we publicize a lot more. There's a culture of publicizing your company through the publication of these reports. So we wind up just kind of seeing this feedback loop of reports about the same actors. It used to be China. That's kind of died down a little bit with some of the accords reached with the Obama administration. And now we're seeing Russia, and there are valid conclusions to be drawn here that, Russia has ramped up a lot of its information operations. And look at the election here. They've been successful. They've been effective. So that's why we're seeing a lot of this. Another question is, how much of a concern is electoral hacking, specifically with respect to Russia? What percentage of the vote in such alleged hacking incidents is cast in doubt? Well, this question gets to the core of why it's so hard to protect against these types of attacks. Because as we've seen with the recount in Wisconsin and Michigan and other places, in some of those cases, the president-elect Trump, wound up getting even more votes. So it's not that, what we're not seeing is some sort of allegation that votes in specific were manipulated. What you're seeing is that voters were manipulated, in the sense of just the sheer amount of information that was either false or misleading, or kind of just exaggerated, through the use of automated bots and things like that, common tools of hackers. That's a much harder question to get at, because what you're basically asking is, was a voter who was going to vote for Hillary Clinton, convinced to vote for Donald Trump, or convinced to not vote at all by some of this information? That's a pretty deep psychological question that, I haven't seen any good research that gets to the bottom of. If anything, the consensus view tends to be that beliefs are reinforced by some of this information. But the idea of vote flipping, because of these information operations, much harder question to get at. Question here is, how can the U.S. spend hundreds of billions of dollars on security and intelligence budgets and still be vulnerable to cyber attacks? Where's the money going? A good question, and the answer, was kind of in the answer I gave not too long ago, which is there's a real problem when the threat vector or the most vulnerable part of your system is the user clicking on a link that they shouldn't. It's really hard to defend against that, because what you have is a user authorizing whoever's in control of that link they just clicked to do stuff to their computer. The cybersecurity industry has really focused on, protecting what experts call the perimeter, which is, protecting attackers from kind of brute forcing their way through your network. We're actually pretty good at that. Not perfect, but, the U.S. and other countries are actually pretty decent at doing that right now. The problem always becomes what happens when you have somebody inside the network doing something they shouldn't, and not because they're knowingly infecting their network. In the case of the DNC hack, it was Hillary Clinton's, campaign manager, John Podesta, clicking on a Google password reset link that was a malicious link. Really hard to protect against. Google does its best to try to flag users when things like that happen. But what winds up being some of the best protection, winds up being using two-factor authentication, which are text message alerts to your phone. Hey, is this really you logging into this account? If so, enter this code. And that's not a perfect protection, but it's far better than having none at all. And before we get to the last question here, I wanted to show one other piece of information that's come up in regard to this Germany election issue. At the beginning of December, WikiLeaks, which published a lot of the leaked Clinton emails, published this. This was a huge file of information, on the German parliament, and specifically 90 gigabytes of data. It's a lot of data. 90 gigabytes of data of information on the German parliament, specifically the German parliament's investigation into collusion or cooperation between Germany and the NSA. Germany's spy chief came out and publicly blamed, the theft and the leak of this data on the same Russian hacking group that hacked the DNC. Now, subsequent to that, there have been multiple reports kind of casting doubt on that, saying, well, maybe it was an insider, inside the German parliament. So that's kind of unclear. However, the early signs out of Germany was that this operation, as well as an earlier operation of hacking into Germany's parliament, we're the same Russian group that hacked the DNC. So this is something, and the point of this show really is what we saw in the U.S. could very well be a prelude to what we might see in Germany and elsewhere throughout Europe. We focus on one country here, but other European nations are also having elections. And this issue of Crimea and Ukraine, has really fractured a lot of very tenuous alliances around the world, and nowhere more so than Germany and other European nations. So it's worth watching out for, because we may see again similar behavior that happened here happen elsewhere in the world. And this is it's more evidence, yet more evidence of how powerful a weapon information can be, when used maliciously. And the last question here is, what countries are most at risk now? The answer is really any country that's connected to the internet. Any country where there's a large percentage of voters who consume information over the internet. This is requiring a complete rethinking of how we consume news and what's the best way to consume news and to fact check things. I mean, when you look at your social media feed, what most of us do is we see headlines and occasionally we'll click in on something. What that means is you're consuming a lot of information that you're not checking or really thinking deeply about. And that's just not the way we've always consumed news. This is a relatively new thing. And hackers are exploiting that. So, any country where there are elections and there's, widespread use of social media, it really requires voters to rethink, how they're interrogating their news sources. And that's a problem that hasn't been solved yet. So, with that, I just wanted to thank everybody who's watching. Again, we do this every week, 1 p.m. Eastern. And as always, if you have any questions offline, we're more than happy to catalog them and try to answer them in future shows. On Twitter, I'm at JordanR1000. Happy to take any of those questions offline. And again, thanks to everybody who watched and to everybody who commented. We always appreciate the engagement. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks very much.